The snow was knee-deep and crusted with ice that cut through the rags wrapped around her feet, and Elara could taste blood in the back of her throat from the cold, that metallic tang that meant her lungs were freezing from the inside out. She knelt behind the pack's wood-splitting station, her fingers so numb she could barely grip the stick she'd sharpened against the stone wall of the cellar where she slept. Every night for the past 3 months, after the pack house went dark and the last of the warriors stumbled to their beds smelling of mead and wood smoke, she came out here to the clearing beyond the eastern tree line. And every night she dragged that sharpened stick through the fresh snow and wrote the same word. Kyle, the name of the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, the man she had never met, the man whose face she had only seen once, carved into the stone monument at the crossroads between pack lands, his jaw set, his eyes rendered in granite but somehow still alive. She didn't know why she wrote it. She didn't know why the letters felt like prayer, like the only sound her body could make since her voice had been taken from her 7 years ago. She only knew that when the stick carved the final letter and the snow held his name, something deep in her chest unclenched, just slightly, like a fist loosening in sleep. She finished the last stroke and sat back on her heels. Her breath came out in thin white threads. Above her, the sky was the color of a bruise, purple-black and starless, and the pines creaked under the weight of ice. She could smell the pack house from here, roasted venison and that sharp, chemical tang of the bleach she'd mopped the kitchen with 6 hours ago. Her hand still burned from it. The skin between her fingers had cracked open weeks ago and wouldn't heal because she couldn't stop cleaning long enough to let it. Elara was the pack's only Omega without a wolf. That was what they told her, anyway, that her wolf had never awakened, that she was wolfless, that she was less than the lowest-ranked member of Ashwood Pack and should be grateful they hadn't turned her out to die in the snow like a runt pup. She'd been 4 years old when they found her on the border, silent even then, clutching a torn piece of cloth embroidered with silver thread that nobody recognized. No parents, no pack markings, no wolf scent. Just a small girl who couldn't speak, and a scrap of fabric that the Alpha's wife, Marjorie, had thrown into the fireplace without a second glance. Marjorie was the one who'd assigned her to the cellars, not the servants' quarters with the other Omegas, who at least had thin mattresses and a wood stove. The cellar, where the stone walls sweated with condensation, and the only warmth came from the hot water pipes that ran overhead, dripping rusty water onto whatever surface she tried to sleep on. She'd learned to position herself between the drips. She'd learned to sleep in 40-minute intervals because the cold would wake her, and she'd have to move to keep from going hypothermic. She'd learned that if she pressed her back against the pipe itself, the heat would leave a burn mark on her skin that lasted for days, but at least kept her alive through the night. She had learned a lot of things that no one had bothered to teach her. Now she stood, brushing the snow from her knees, and looked down at the name one more time. Kale. Tomorrow the snow would cover it. Tomorrow night she would write it again. This was the only ritual she had, the only thing that belonged entirely to her. She turned to go back, and stopped. There were footprints in the snow, not hers. These were massive, deep-set, the imprint of boots that must have belonged to someone well over 6 feet tall. They came from the north, cutting a clean line through the untouched snow between the pines, and they stopped roughly 30 feet from where she knelt. Stopped, and then turned, as if someone had stood there, watching her write, and then walked away. Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. She pressed her hand to her chest as if she could hold it still. No one from Ashwood came out this far at night. The eastern clearing was too close to the border of the Northern Territories, and nobody crossed that border. Not since the Alpha King had declared that any wolf found on his land without invitation would lose their tongue. She stared at the footprints until her vision blurred. Then she turned and ran back to the cellar on legs that shook from cold, and something else, something that felt like the first tremor before an earthquake, the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she knew. The next morning, Bram found her mopping the great hall before dawn, which was the only time she was allowed in the main house. Bram was Marjorie's son, the pack beta's eldest, 23 years old, and built like a boulder with roughly the same intellectual depth. He smelled like stale bear and the cheap cologne he'd doused himself in to mask the fact that he hadn't shifted in weeks. Some wolves ran every night. Bram hadn't run since he'd pulled a muscle in his hind leg during a hunt and decided that healing was beneath him. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her work. Elara kept her eyes on the floor, moving the mop in slow, careful arcs around the legs of the massive oak table where the pack ate their meals. Meals she was never invited to, meals she scraped from the plates afterward if there was anything left, which there usually wasn't, because Bram ate like a man trying to fill a hole that food couldn't reach. "Hey," he said. "Mute. Look at me when I'm talking to you." She didn't look up. She had learned that looking up was an invitation for him to find something wrong with her face. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knocked the mop from her hands. It clattered against the stone floor, the sound sharp as a slap in the empty hall. I said, "Look at me." She looked up. His eyes were pale brown, almost yellow in the thin morning light, and there was something in them that wasn't quite cruelty. It was more like boredom, the kind of boredom that comes from being the biggest person in a room full of people too scared to push back. She had seen this look before. It meant he was going to do something mean for no reason other than that he could. "Mother says you've been sneaking out at night." He tilted his head. "What are you doing out there?" Elara opened her mouth. Nothing came out. It never did. The sound had been taken from her the same night she'd been found on the border, though she didn't remember how. She gestured toward the back door, then mimed sweeping. "Sweeping the snow?" He snorted. "You're a bad liar even without words, you know that?" He grabbed her wrist. His fingers overlapped around it easily, which told her more about how thin she'd gotten than any mirror could. He twisted, not enough to break anything, just enough to send a bright wire of pain up her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. Pulling away made it worse. "If I find out you're going near the border," he said, his voice dropping to something that might have been genuine concern if she squinted hard enough, "Mother will throw you out, and you won't last a week." He let go, looked at her for a moment longer, and something shifted in his face. A flicker, like a candle behind a dirty window. "Just stay inside at night, all right? It's not safe out there." Then he left, grabbing an apple from the bowl on the table and biting into it as he walked, and she was alone again with the mop and the cold water and the ache in her wrist. But she went out again that night. She always did. The footprints were there again. Same boots, same massive stride, same path from the north, stopping 30 feet from the clearing, then turning back. But this time they were closer, 25 feet maybe, as if whoever was watching had taken 5 steps forward before deciding to retreat. Elara knelt in the snow and stared at them. Her fingers tightened around her sharpened stick. Then she turned to the fresh powder in front of her, and very deliberately wrote the name again. Kyle. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know if the footprints belonged to a scout or a rogue or something worse. But the writing felt like it mattered now in a way it hadn't before. like someone was reading it. She left the name in the snow and went back to the cellar and lay on the cold stone floor and pressed her back against the hot pipe until the burn mark from last night reopened, and she fell asleep to the sound of water dripping and the smell of rust and damp earth and the echo of a name she couldn't say aloud. The footprints came every night that week, each night closer. 30 feet became 20, became 15, became 10, and each night Ilara wrote the name, and each morning the snow covered it, and each evening she came back and wrote it again. On the 7th night, the footprints didn't stop. She was kneeling in the snow, finishing the final stroke of the letter L, when she heard the branch snap. Not a small branch either, a thick one, the kind that only breaks under serious weight. The sound came from directly behind her, maybe 8 feet away, and every muscle in her body went rigid. The smell hit her first, pine resin and cold stone and something beneath that. Something warm, like embers banked in ash, like the last heat of a fire that had burned all night and refused to go out. It filled her lungs and spread through her chest and down into her stomach, and she felt something inside her move, something that had been sleeping so long she'd forgotten it existed. It shifted behind her ribs like a creature turning in its den, and her hands began to shake, not from the cold, but from something that felt terrifyingly like recognition. She turned around slowly. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Not just tall, but wide, the kind of build that came from years of fighting and running in wolf form, shoulders that blocked out the tree line behind him, arms folded across a chest, covered in a black, fur-lined coat that was open at the throat despite the freezing air. His skin was brown, weathered, scarred along the left side of his jaw in a thick white line that ran from his ear to his chin. His hair was black and longer than she'd expected, pulled back from his face in a way that made the sharp angles of his cheekbones look like they'd been cut from the same granite as his monument at the crossroads. And his eyes were amber. Not brown, not gold. Amber, like tree sap with sunlight trapped inside it, and they were looking at her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not disgust, not the blank dismissal of someone looking through her as if she weren't there. He was looking at her the way you look at something you've been searching for your entire life. "It's you," he said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel rolling over itself, and it vibrated through her bones in a way that made her teeth ache. She could feel it in the soles of her feet, in the palms of her hands, in the hollow space behind her sternum, where that sleeping thing had just woken up and was now pressing against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He took a step forward. The snow compressed under his boot with a sound like crushed glass. "I've been watching you for a week. Every night you come out here and write my name in the snow." He paused. "Why?" She shook her head. She couldn't answer, even if she wanted to. The tears were already coming, hot against her frozen cheeks, and she hated them, hated that her body betrayed her when her voice wouldn't. He took another step, close enough now that she could see the individual scars on his knuckles, the calluses on his fingers, the thin gold chain around his neck with a pendant she couldn't make out in the dark. Close enough that the heat of his body reached her through the cold air, and she realized she was shivering, not from the temperature but from the proximity of him, from the way every cell in her body was orienting toward him, like iron filings toward a magnet. "You can't speak," he said. Not a question. His brow furrowed, and something dark moved behind his eyes. "Who took your voice?" She shook her head again. He crouched. This brought him to her eye level, and the effect was devastating. Up close, his face was less monument and more human, the scar tissue puckered and rough, the lines around his eyes deeper than they should have been for a man who couldn't be older than 30. He smelled like pine, and smoke, and something underneath that was purely biological, the scent of an alpha in his prime, and her body responded to it with a violence that terrified her. Her skin flushed hot, her pulse hammered in the artery at her throat. That thing behind her ribs was clawing now, actually clawing, and she pressed her hand to her chest and gasped. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too." He reached out and took her hand, the one pressed to her chest. His fingers were warm, impossibly warm for someone standing in below-zero air without gloves. When his skin touched hers, something happened that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe and never quite finding the words for. It was like a door opening in a room she hadn't known existed. It was like stepping from shadow into sunlight, so bright it hurt. It was like hearing music after years of silence, except she hadn't heard music. She'd heard nothing. She'd been silent for 7 years, and now her wolf, the wolf they told her didn't exist, rose up inside her like a wave and howled. She felt the howl in her chest even though no sound came from her mouth. His eyes widened. The amber irises caught what little moonlight filtered through the clouds, and for a moment they glowed, actually glowed, like a predator's eyes in headlight beams. "You have a wolf," he breathed. "They told you that you didn't, but you do. I can feel her." He squeezed her hand. "She's been caged. Someone caged her." Ilara stared at him. The tears were freezing on her cheeks. She wanted to ask how he knew, wanted to demand he explain what was happening, wanted to scream or laugh or run, but all she could do was kneel in the snow and hold his hand and feel the bond between them tighten like a rope being pulled taut. "My name is Kyle Vosick," he said. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and you are my mate." He said it the way someone might state that the sky was above them. Fact. Certainty. Bedrock. "I've been waiting for you for 12 years. I will not wait any longer." He stood and pulled her gently to her feet. Her legs buckled, and he caught her, one arm around her waist, and the shock of his body against hers was so overwhelming that she went momentarily blind. When her vision came back, she was pressed against his chest, and the fur lining of his coat was soft against her cheek, and she could hear his heartbeat, steady and deep, the heartbeat of something ancient and powerful and entirely focused on her. "Come with me," he said. She pulled back, shook her head, pointed toward the pack house, barely visible through the trees, a dim glow of firelight in the distance. She mimed sleeping, then pointed to herself, then to the ground. "Here, I stay here." His jaw tightened. She watched the muscle work beneath the scar. "You want to stay with the pack that starves you?" He looked down at her, at the rags wrapped around her feet, at the cracked skin on her hands, at the way her collarbones jutted through the threadbare fabric of her dress. "You're half dead, little wolf. Your lips are blue. When was the last time you ate a full meal?" She couldn't remember. "That's what I thought." He cupped her face in both hands, tilting it up toward him. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, and she felt something warm wherever he touched, as if his skin was a balm against the cold. "I'm not asking you to trust me yet. I'm asking you to survive the night. Come with me. Eat something warm. Sleep somewhere that won't freeze you in your sleep. And in the morning, if you want to come back to this place, I'll bring you back myself." She hesitated. "Please," he said, and the way he said it, That single word from a man who clearly never begged for anything broke something open inside her. She nodded. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her in one fluid motion. It swallowed her entirely, the hem dragging in the snow, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, and the heat of him was still trapped in the fur lining. She sank into it like sinking into a warm bath, and a sound escaped her. Not a word, not a voice, just a small exhale of relief that seemed to affect him more than anything else. His eyes darkened. His hands curled at his sides. "Walk with me," he said, "or I can carry you." She walked. He matched his stride to hers, which meant he was moving at roughly a quarter of his natural pace, and he kept one hand at the small of her back, and the snow crunched beneath them in a rhythm that felt almost like music. They crossed the border of the Northern Territories 20 minutes later. She knew the moment they crossed because the air changed. The oppressive weight of Ashwood Pack's territory, that constant low-grade feeling of being watched and judged and found wanting, lifted off her shoulders like a physical burden being removed. The trees here were older, taller, their branches heavy with snow that glittered in the moonlight like crushed diamonds. The trail was cleared, marked with torches that burned blue, some kind of wolf fire she'd never seen before, and the light cast strange, beautiful shadows across the snow. His estate emerged from the forest like something out of a fever dream. It wasn't a pack house. It was a fortress built of dark timber and stone, sprawling across a ridge overlooking a frozen river, its windows glowing warm amber from within. Smoke curled from 3 separate chimneys, and the smell of it was birch and cedar. Clean smoke, warm smoke, the kind that made you think of safety. 2 guards at the gate snapped to attention as Kyle approached. Their eyes slid to Ilara, and she saw the flash of surprise, then understanding, then something that looked like reverence. One of them, a woman with close-cropped silver hair and a scar bisecting her left eyebrow, pressed her fist to her chest and bowed. "My king! Is she—" "She is," Kyle said. "Prepare the east wing, draw a bath, and bring food to my study. Nothing heavy. Broth, bread, something easy on an empty stomach." The guard nodded and disappeared inside. Kyle led Ilara through the front doors into a great hall that smelled of old wood and beeswax, and the faintest undercurrent of wolf, not the dank, aggressive scent of Ashwood, but something cleaner, wilder, like the difference between a caged animal and a free one. He brought her to a room at the end of a long corridor. It was smaller than she expected, warm, with a fire already burning in a stone fireplace and a large leather chair beside a desk covered in maps and papers. A study. His study, she realized, from the way the scent of him concentrated here. Pine and smoke and embers. He pulled the chair closer to the fire and gestured for her to sit. She did, and the leather was warm and soft, and the fire was so close she could feel it on her shins, and she wanted to cry again, but was too tired. A knock at the door. The silver-haired guard entered carrying a tray. A bowl of bone broth, steam curling off the surface, a thick slice of dark bread with butter, a cup of something that smelled of honey and chamomile. The guard set it on the desk and left without a word, but she paused at the door and looked back at Ilara with an expression that was startlingly gentle for a warrior, almost maternal. Kyle pulled a second chair across from her and sat. "Eat," he said, slowly. She picked up the bowl. Her hands were shaking so badly that the broth sloshed over the rim, and he reached over and steadied her grip with both hands wrapped around hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, his large, scarred hands holding hers around the warm ceramic bowl, and neither of them moved. She drank the broth in small sips. It was rich and salted, and faintly herbal, and it hit her empty stomach like a fist of warmth. She ate the bread in pieces, chewing carefully because her jaw ached from clenching it against the cold for hours. She drank the chamomile tea and felt the heat spread through her chest and down into her fingers and toes. The sensation of being warm all the way through was so foreign that it made her dizzy. Kyle watched her eat. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He sat in the chair across from her, with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and his amber eyes tracking every movement she made, every sip, every bite, every flicker of expression across her face, and she understood that he was memorizing her, learning her. The way a man who had waited 12 years for something would study it when it finally arrived. When she finished, he stood and led her to the east wing. The room was enormous, far too large for one person, with a bed big enough for 3 people, and piled with furs and quilts that looked thick enough to drown in. A copper bathtub stood in the corner, already filled, steam rising from the water's surface. Someone had placed clean clothes on the bed, a simple wool dress in deep green, thick socks, a pair of soft leather boots. "Bathe," he said. "Sleep." The door locks from the inside. He pulled a key from the desk and pressed it into her palm. "No one enters without your permission, including me." He turned to leave. She caught his sleeve. He stopped, looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. She could see the restraint in his jaw, the way every line of his body was taut with the effort of not pulling her against him. The bond between them hummed like a plucked wire, and she could feel his wolf just beneath the surface of his skin, pressing outward, wanting. She pointed to herself, then to her throat. Then she shook her head. "You want to know if I care that you can't speak?" he said. She nodded. He was quiet for a long time. Then he crouched again, the way he had in the snow, bringing himself to her level, and he took her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating, strong and steady. "My wolf knew you before you wrote the first letter," he said. "She's been calling to me across the border for months. I don't need your voice, Ilara. I need you alive." She blinked. She hadn't told him her name. "You're not as unknown as they let you believe," he said. "Sleep now. I'll explain tomorrow." Then he left, pulling the door closed behind him, and she heard his footsteps recede down the corridor, heavy and deliberate. The footsteps of a man forcing himself to walk away from the only thing he wanted. She locked the door. She bathed in water so hot it turned her cold, ravaged skin bright red, and the heat seeped into her muscles and her bones, and the places where the pipe burns crisscrossed her back, and she pressed her forehead against her drawn-up knees and shook without sound in the steam. She slept in the enormous bed under furs that smelled faintly of cedar, and didn't dream at all. Morning came grey and quiet. Snow was falling again, thick flakes that accumulated on the windowsill and muffled the world outside. Ilara lay in the bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, which was made of dark timber beams carved with running wolves. She ran her fingers over the furs. They were real, not synthetic. Mink, maybe. Impossibly soft. Her body ached in the way that bodies ache when they've been running on adrenaline and cold for months, and are only now realizing how damaged they are. Her feet were swollen, covered in small cuts from the ice crust. Her hands were a mess of cracked skin and bleach burns. Her ribs were countable through her skin. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been slowly dying and hadn't noticed because dying slowly just felt like living. A knock at the door. She wrapped one of the furs around her shoulders and unlocked it. It wasn't Kyle. It was the silver-haired guard from last night, carrying another tray. Eggs this time, soft scrambled and steaming, toast with some kind of berry preserves, a pot of tea, a glass of water with a slice of lemon floating in it. "I'm Rena," the guard said. She had a low, gravelly voice, and the build of a woman who could bench press a small car. "Head of the King's Guard. He asked me to check on you." She set the tray on the bedside table and looked at Ilara with those pale grey eyes. "He also said to tell you that the offer stands. If you want to go back to Ashwood, he'll take you himself." Ilara looked at the food, at the fire, which someone had relit while she slept, at the clean dress laid across the end of the bed, at the boots that looked like they might actually fit her feet. She shook her head. Rena's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Good," she said. "Eat your breakfast. He'll be in the West Hall when you're ready." Ilara ate everything on the tray. Every bite. She ate the way people eat when they've been hungry for so long that food becomes almost frightening in its abundance, slowly and carefully, and with the constant low-level expectation that someone was going to take it away. No one took it away. She dressed in the green wool dress, which was too large but warm, and the boots, which fit perfectly and were lined with something impossibly soft. She braided her hair, which was long and dark and hadn't been properly washed in weeks, and the braid felt like a small act of reclamation. She looked at herself in the mirror above the wash basin and saw a woman who was too thin and too pale and scarred in places that scarring shouldn't happen, but who was also clean and warm and fed for the first time in years. She went to find Kyle. The West Hall was a long room with a wall of windows that overlooked the frozen river. The light was silver-white, snow-light, and it made everything look like it existed inside a photograph. Kyle was standing at the far end, talking with two men who were nearly as large as he was, warriors clearly, with the same watchful stance and the same aura of barely contained power. When she entered, all three of them turned. Kyle's eyes found her immediately. She watched something move across his face, that same expression from last night, wonder layered with relief, layered with something possessive and hungry that he was clearly trying to control. He dismissed the warriors with a gesture, and they left, both of them glancing at her with undisguised curiosity. "You stayed," he said. She nodded. He crossed the room to her. In the daylight, he looked different than he had in the dark. The scar on his jaw was more visible, thick and ragged, and there were others she hadn't noticed, a thin line across his left temple, a constellation of small marks on his forearms. His eyes were lighter in the snowlight, almost golden. He moved like something that had learned to be careful with its own strength, deliberate, contained, the way a predator moves when it doesn't want to frighten prey. He stopped 2 feet from her. "I owe you answers." She waited. 7 years ago, he said, a delegation from the Eastern Pack crossed into our territory with a child. She was 4 years old, silent, and she carried a piece of cloth embroidered with the crest of the lunar bloodline. Ilara's breath stopped. The lunar bloodline died out 50 years ago. That's what everyone believes. But the truth is that the last Lunar Alpha had a daughter, and that daughter had a daughter, and that granddaughter was hidden at birth because there were people who wanted the bloodline erased entirely. The Lunars were too powerful. Their wolves could do things other wolves couldn't. Heal, see through wards, break enchantments. He paused. Cage wolves that should have been free. She was shaking again. Not from cold. Ashwood didn't find you by accident, Ilara. They were paid to take you in and keep you silent. The enchantment on your voice was placed there by someone who knew what the lunar wolves could do. because a lunar wolf's howl can shatter bindings. If you could speak, if you could howl, the cage around your wolf would break, and anyone within 100 miles would know exactly what you are. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the pendant on the gold chain. She could see it now in the daylight. It was small, silver, shaped like a crescent moon with a wolf's eye at its center. "This was your mother's," he said. "It was sent to me 12 years ago, before she died, with a letter asking me to find her daughter when the time was right." He held it out to her. "The footprints in the snow weren't chance. I've been looking for you since the day I took the throne. But the enchantment hid you. Your scent was suppressed. Your wolf was caged. I searched every pack in every territory and found nothing." His jaw tightened, until 3 months ago when I felt something. Like a whisper, like a thread pulling at the edge of my awareness. So I went to the border every night and waited. And then I saw you." He pressed the pendant into her palm. The metal was warm from his skin. "You wrote my name in the snow," he said. "How did you know?" She closed her fingers around the pendant. How could she explain something she didn't understand herself? How could she tell him that she'd seen his face carved in stone and felt something crack open inside her, that writing his name was the only thing that made her feel like she existed, that she'd been reaching for him through the only medium available to her, letter by letter, night after night, in a language that wasn't quite language. She pointed to her chest, her heart. He exhaled. It came out ragged, and she realized with a jolt that he was fighting something. Some enormous emotion that was pressing against the walls of his composure. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories, feared by every pack on the continent, was standing in front of her, trying not to fall apart. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Mine too." The days that followed were strange and careful. Kyle kept his distance physically, sleeping in his own quarters at the opposite end of the house. But he was everywhere else. At meals, sitting across from her, watching her eat with that same careful attention. In the study, teaching her the sign language that his warriors used in battle, his large hands moving through the gestures with surprising grace. In the West Hall, showing her maps of the territories, pointing out borders and trade routes, and the location of every pack that had ever owed fealty to the lunar line. She learned quickly. She had always been a fast learner, which was another thing Ashwood had never cared to notice. Within a week, she could sign full sentences. Within 2, she could hold conversations. The first time she signed something that made Cale laugh, a dry observation about the size of his ego relative to his territory, he laughed so hard the window rattled, and Renna stuck her head in from the hallway to make sure nobody was dying. But the bond was becoming harder to manage. Every day it grew stronger, a physical pull between them that made the air thick when they were in the same room. She could feel his emotions now, bleeding through the bond like watercolors through wet paper. His frustration when dealing with border disputes, his quiet satisfaction when his warriors trained well, his longing, which was constant and deep and colored everything else like a dye that wouldn't wash out. She could feel him at night, lying in his bed at the opposite end of the house, wide awake, his wolf pacing behind his ribs the same way hers was pacing behind hers. The cage around her wolf had not broken yet, but it was weakening. She could feel it. The bars were bending. Something was pressing against them from inside, growing stronger every day, fed by the bond, fed by his proximity, fed by the safety that was slowly teaching her body to stop bracing for impact. On the 12th night, she woke to find herself standing at his door. She didn't remember walking there. The stone floor was cold under her bare feet. and she was wearing one of the nightgowns Rena had left for her. Thin white cotton that did nothing against the chill of the corridor. She was standing with her hand raised, about to knock, and she didn't know how she'd gotten there. The door opened before she could touch it. Kyle stood in the doorway, shirtless, his chest a landscape of old scars and dense muscle, and his eyes were glowing, not reflecting light, generating it. The amber irises were luminous, and behind them, his wolf was right there, right at the surface, looking at her through his eyes. "I know," he said. "I felt you coming." She signed, "The bond." "The bond," he agreed. He looked at her standing in the corridor in her thin nightgown, barefoot, her hair loose and dark over her shoulders, and she watched him grip the doorframe with one hand, his knuckles going white. "You should go back to your room," she signed. "Why?" "Because if you come in here, I won't be able to let you leave." She looked at him, at the restraint carved into every line of his body, at the way his chest rose and fell with measured breaths, at the hand on the door frame that was slowly splintering the wood. She thought about the cellar at Ashwood, the dripping pipes, the cold stone, the way she used to burn herself on purpose just to stay alive through the night. She thought about the name she'd written in the snow, over and over, because some part of her had always known. She stepped forward and pressed her palm flat against his chest. His wolf surged. She felt it through her hand, a vibration that ran up her arm and into her chest, and her own wolf responded with a force that made her gasp. The cage inside her groaned. The bars bent further. Something cracked. Kyle's hand came up to cover hers. "Elara." She signed with her free hand. "I'm not going back to my room." He pulled her inside and closed the door. Nothing happened that night that she would have been embarrassed to describe. He held her. That was all. He lay on his back in the enormous bed, and she curled against his side with her head on his chest and his arm around her, and the heat of him was nothing like the hot pipe in the cellar. It was alive, constant, given freely, and it didn't burn. His heartbeat under her ear was slow and steady, and his breathing gradually deepened as sleep took him, and she lay there in the dark with her palm flat against his ribs and felt the vibration of his wolf and her wolf communicating in a language that predated speech, predated writing, predated the snow and the stick and the letters she'd carved into the frozen ground. She slept better than she had in 7 years. But the peace didn't last. On the 15th day, a messenger arrived from Ashwood. Elara was in the kitchen with the pack's cook, a large, cheerful woman named Dover, who had taken one look at Elara's cracked hands and started teaching her how to make salves from beeswax and calendula. Elara was grinding dried flowers with a mortar and pestle, the stone rough against her palms, the smell of the calendula sweet and dusty, when Rena appeared in the doorway. "The king wants you in the West Hall," Rena said. Her face was carefully blank, which Elara had learned meant something bad was happening. In the West Hall, Kyle stood at the window with his back to the room. 2 of his warriors flanked the door. Between them, on his knees, was a man Elara recognized. Bram. He looked terrible. His lip was split, his left eye swollen shut, and his clothes were torn and stained with mud and snow. He was breathing hard, the panicked breaths of someone who had run a very long way and was now regretting the destination. "Tell her what you told me," Kyle said without turning around. Bram's one open eye found Elara. He flinched, actually flinched, and she saw something in his face that she had never seen there before. Shame. Not fear, though there was fear too, plenty of it. But underneath the fear was a specific, grinding shame that pulled his features into something almost unrecognizable. "Marjorie's coming," he said. His voice was hoarse. She found out you're here. She's coming with 30 wolves and a warlock named Cyrus." Cale turned around. The look on his face would have dropped a lesser man to the floor. "And the warlock?" Bram swallowed. "He's the one who put the enchantment on her. 7 years ago, Marjorie paid him. The whole pack paid him. Your mother—" He looked at Ilara. "Your mother was dying when they brought you to us. The lunar bloodline was supposed to be extinct. Marjorie was afraid that if anyone found out you existed, the old alliances would reform and Ashwood would be nothing again. So she had Cyrus cage your wolf and silence your voice. And she was supposed to raise you until the cage became permanent." "Permanent," Kyle repeated. "The enchantment feeds on isolation," Bram said. He was looking at the floor now, unable to meet anyone's eyes. If the wolf stays caged long enough without the bond of a mate or a pack, the cage becomes part of the wolf. Permanent. Irreversible. Another year and it would have— He stopped. "Killed her," Kyle finished. The silence in the room was absolute. Ilara could hear the fire crackling. She could hear the snow falling against the windows. She could hear her own heartbeat, wild and irregular, and she could feel Kyle's through the bond, steady as a war drum. "Why are you telling me this?" Kyle's voice was dangerously quiet. Bram looked up, and there it was again, that flicker she'd seen in the great hall at Ashwood when he'd told her to stay inside at night, that candle behind the dirty window. "Because what we did was wrong," he said. "I knew it was wrong when I was 12, and she was sleeping in the cellar, and I could hear her coughing through the floor. I knew it was wrong every single day, and I did nothing, and I'll live with that. But Marjorie won't stop. She won't stop until the cage is permanent or Ilara is dead, because if Ilara's wolf wakes up, every wolf on this continent will feel it, and the lunar line will be restored, and Marjorie's power will mean nothing." Kyle stared at him for a long time. "How long until she arrives?" 2 days. Maybe less. Kyle looked at Renna. "Double the border guard. Put archers on the ridge. And find me everything we have on warlock enchantments." Renna nodded and left. Kyle looked down at Bram, who was still on his knees, still bleeding from his split lip, still wearing that unfamiliar expression of bottomless regret. "You ran through a blizzard to warn us," Kyle said. "I did. Your mother will consider that treason." Bram's laugh was bitter. "My mother considered it treason when I snuck bread to her cellar on Tuesdays." Ilara went still. She stared at Bram. Every Tuesday for as long as she could remember, she had found a piece of bread wrapped in cloth at the top of the cellar stairs. She had always assumed it was an accident, something dropped by a careless cook, too mundane to be intentional. She'd eaten it every time, savoring it, stretching it through the day. Tuesday bread. Bram met her eyes. "I should have done more," he said. "I know that." Kyle said, "Take him to the East Barracks. Feed him. Treat his wounds." He paused. "He stays under guard, but he's not a prisoner." The warriors hauled Bram to his feet and led him out. When the door closed, Kyle turned to Ilara, and the composure he'd been holding cracked. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her against him, and she could feel the tremor in his arms, the barely contained fury vibrating through his body. "They were killing you," he said into her hair. "Slowly, deliberately, killing you, and I didn't find you fast enough." She pressed her hands against his back and held on. The bond between them was blazing now, so bright she could almost see it, a thread of gold connecting her ribcage to his. He pulled back enough to look at her. "The warlock. If he's the one who placed the enchantment, he can strengthen it. We need to break it before he gets here." She signed. "How? I don't know yet. But we'll find a way." They didn't sleep that night. Kyle sent riders to 3 allied packs, requesting information on warlock enchantments. He pulled every book from his library that referenced lunar wolves and spread them across the study floor, and they sat together in the firelight, reading, searching, while the snow piled against the windows and the hours burned away. At 3 a.m, Ilara found it. Not in a book, but in a margin. A note, handwritten in faded ink, in a copy of an ancient treatise on wolf bonds. The note said, "The lunar howl breaks all cages. The voice is the key. The mate bond is the door." She showed it to Kyle. He read it twice. "Your voice was taken specifically to prevent this," he said slowly. "If you could howl, the cage would shatter. But you can't howl because the enchantment silenced you." He ran his hand through his hair, thinking. Unless. He looked at her. "The mate bond is the door. What if my voice can be your voice? What if the bond can carry the howl?" She didn't understand. He took her hands. In the old texts, completed mate bonds create a shared channel. Emotions, sensations, even thoughts can pass between bonded mates. If we complete the bond, fully, the marking, the claim, everything, my wolf could howl through the bond, and your wolf might hear it and respond. It might be enough to break the cage from inside. She signed. "You want to complete the bond now?" "I wanted to complete the bond the moment I saw you in the snow," he said. "But not like this. Not because we're running out of time. I wanted—" He stopped, looked away. The firelight caught the scar on his jaw, and she realized she had never seen him look uncertain before. "I wanted to give you time to choose me. Not because of the bond. Not because of survival. Because you wanted to." She reached up and turned his face back toward her. His eyes were bright, not glowing. Just bright with something raw and unguarded that he probably hadn't shown anyone in years. She signed slowly, carefully, making sure he could read every gesture. "I chose you when I wrote your name in the snow. I chose you every night for 3 months. I chose you before I knew what choosing meant." His breath caught. He pressed his forehead against hers, and she could feel his wolf shaking, actually trembling, the way large predators tremble when they're overwhelmed by something they can't hunt or fight or outrun. "Then we do this tonight," he said. The marking ceremony was nothing like the public rituals she had glimpsed at Ashwood, those performative displays with witnesses and speeches, and the forced solemnity of wolves going through motions they'd rehearsed. This was private. This was just the 2 of them in the study with the fire burning low and the snow falling outside and the books scattered across the floor like leaves after a storm. He knelt in front of her. The Alpha King on his knees. She could see what it cost him, not the physical act of kneeling, which was nothing, but the submission of it, the deliberate lowering of himself before his mate. His wolf didn't submit easily. She could feel the struggle through the bond, the ancient predator wrestling with the act of bowing. "I offer you my mark," he said. The formal words, old words, the ones that had been spoken by wolves for 1,000 years. "My protection, my territory, my life. I offer you my wolf. I offer you everything I am and everything I will be." She couldn't say the words back. She couldn't say anything, but she could answer. She tilted her head to the side, baring the left side of her neck, the smooth skin over the artery where the marking bite would go, the most vulnerable part of her body, offered to the most dangerous predator she had ever met. His eyes blazed amber. His wolf pressed forward, and she could see the shift happening at the edges of his features, the slight elongation of his canines, the thickening of the muscles across his shoulders. He leaned in, and his breath was warm against her neck, and she could feel his lips brush the skin where the bite would go, and everything in her body went still and sharp and focused. He bit down. The pain was brief and blinding. She gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders, fingers digging into the muscle there. Then the pain transformed, became something else, became a channel opening between them so wide and so deep that she fell into it head first. She could feel his wolf, enormous and dark and ancient, pressing against the barrier of his human skin. She could feel his heartbeat in her own chest. She could feel his emotions, not as abstractions, but as physical sensations. His love for her was warm, a constant heat source, like the sun on stone. His fear for her was sharp, a knife edge, a blade he'd been carrying for 12 years. His rage at what had been done to her was vast, an ocean of dark water that he kept walled off through sheer force of will. And then she felt it, his wolf reaching for her through the bond. Not his voice, but his howl, that primal sound that lived at the center of every wolf, channeled through the golden thread that connected them. It hit her like a wave, deep inside her, behind the bars of the cage that had held her wolf captive for 7 years. Something answered. Her wolf lifted her head, opened her mouth, and howled. No sound came from Ilara's throat, but the howl moved through her body like an earthquake, shaking the cage from the inside, and she felt the bars crack. One, then another, then all of them at once, shattering like ice under pressure, and her wolf surged forward with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. The room exploded with light. Not firelight, not moonlight. Something else. Something silver-white and radiant, pouring from her skin, from her eyes, from the marking bite on her neck. The books on the floor fluttered. The fire flared and then went out. The windows frosted over in an instant, intricate patterns of ice spreading across the glass like living things. Kyle pulled back from the bite, blood on his lips, and his eyes were wide with something she had never seen on his face before. Awe. "There you are," he whispered. "There's my wolf." Ilara opened her mouth and screamed. It wasn't a scream. It was a howl, the howl that had been building inside her for 7 years, and it ripped from her throat with a force that shattered every window in the study and sent cracks racing up the stone walls. The sound was not human. It was vast and silver and ancient, and it carried across the frozen landscape like a shock wave, rolling over the trees, over the river, over the mountains, out and out and out, until every wolf within 100 miles stopped what they were doing and lifted their heads and felt the hair on their arms stand up. The lunar wolf had awakened. Ilara fell forward, and Kyle caught her. She was shaking violently, the silver light fading from her skin, and she could feel her wolf inside her now, not caged, not sleeping, but fully awake and fully present, a massive creature of moonlight and shadow curling around her consciousness like a cat claiming a lap. Her wolf was enormous, bigger than any wolf she'd ever sensed, bigger even than Kale's, and ancient in a way that transcended age. This was a bloodline wolf, carrying the memories and power of every lunar alpha who had come before. She looked up at Kyle. The marking bite on her neck was bleeding, warm blood running down her collarbone and soaking into the green wool dress, and his own neck was bare, unmarked. She reached for him, pulled his head down. He went willingly, tilting his neck to the side, and she pressed her lips to the skin over his pulse, tasting salt and smoke, and she felt her canines extend for the first time in her life, sharp and certain, and she bit down. He growled. The sound was enormous, filling the room, vibrating through the floor, and his arms tightened around her until she could barely breathe. The bond completed with a sound like a door slamming shut in a cathedral, resonant and final, and she could feel everything. His wolf pressed against hers through the bond, and their wolves circled each other in a space that existed between their minds, nuzzling, scenting, claiming. When she pulled back, his eyes were closed. Blood ran down his neck in a thin line, and she pressed her fingers to the wound gently, feeling it already beginning to close under her touch. Lunar healing, her birthright. He opened his eyes. "Say my name," he said. She opened her mouth. Her throat ached. Her vocal cords vibrated for the first time in 7 years, rusty and raw and unpracticed. "Kale," she whispered. The sound was barely there, hoarse and cracked and thin as paper. But it was a sound, her voice. He pulled her against him and buried his face in her hair, and she felt the wetness on her scalp, the great alpha king of the Northern Territories crying into her hair without making a sound, and she held him and let him. Because some things required no words at all. They had one day of the bond settling into their bodies like mortar between bricks, filling every crack, sealing every gap. One day of Ilara's wolf learning to stretch inside her, cautious and curious, like a creature testing the boundaries of a new den. One day of her voice returning in fragments, single words at first, then short phrases, each one a small victory that left her throat raw, and Kale looking at her like she'd hung the moon itself from a string. Then the scouts returned with news that Marjorie's forces had crossed the border. 30 wolves and a warlock, moving fast through the snow. They would reach the fortress by nightfall. Kyle transformed in front of her for the first time. It happened in the courtyard, surrounded by his warriors, and it was nothing like the slow, painful shifts she'd witnessed at Ashwood. He shed his human form the way water sheds from rock, smooth and fast and almost casual, and what emerged was the largest wolf she had ever seen. Black-furred, amber-eyed, standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, with scars that showed through his coat like seams in leather. He shook himself once, and the snow around him billowed outward in a ring, and every warrior in the courtyard dropped their eyes. He pressed his massive head against her chest. She put her hands on either side of his muzzle, and felt the vibration of his wolf communicating with hers, the wordless conversation that flowed through the bond like water. "Stay safe. Stay inside. I'll come back to you." She signed, even though he couldn't read it in this form. "Come back to me." He turned and ran, and his warriors ran with him, and within seconds the courtyard was empty, except for Renna and 2 guards and the falling snow, and the sound of 40 wolves moving through the forest like a dark tide. Renna brought her inside. "He'll be fine," she said, with the confidence of someone who had watched their king fight 100 battles and win every single one. But Ilara could feel his emotions through the bond, the grim focus, the controlled rage, and beneath it, threading through everything else like a vein of metal in stone, fear. Not for himself, for her. She sat in the study with the shattered windows and the cracked walls and waited. The battle came to her anyway. She felt it before she heard it. A pressure in the air, a wrongness, like a note played slightly out of tune. The warlock. She could feel his magic the way you feel a thunderstorm approaching, that electric tension, that taste of ozone on the back of her tongue. Then Renna burst through the door, bleeding from a gash across her forearm. They circled around. 5 wolves came from the south. The warlock is with them. The explosion hit the east wall before Renna finished speaking. Stone and timber blew inward, and Ilara threw herself to the floor, covering her head, and felt debris rain down around her. When she looked up, there was a hole in the wall big enough to walk through, and standing in it was a man she had never seen before. He was thin, older, with a face like a blade, and eyes that were entirely white. No iris, no pupil, just flat white orbs that reflected the firelight like porcelain. He wore robes that were too light for the weather and didn't seem to notice the cold. His hands were raised, and between them floated a sphere of dark energy that crackled and spat like grease in a hot pan. "There you are," he said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, almost warm. "The little Luna pup, all grown up." Renna charged him. He flicked his wrist, and she slammed into the far wall with a crack that Elara felt in her teeth. Renna slid to the floor and didn't move. Cyrus stepped through the hole in the wall. Behind him, she could hear wolves fighting, the snarling and snapping and the wet sounds of teeth meeting flesh. But the sounds were distant, muffled by the storm and the stone walls and the blood pounding in her ears. "Marjorie wants you alive," he said, walking toward her slowly. "But honestly, I don't think that's wise anymore. I caged your wolf once. I can feel that the cage is broken. That means the binding has to be permanent." He smiled. The other kind of permanent. Elara scrambled backward. Her wolf rose inside her, massive and furious, pressing against her consciousness with an urgency that felt like panic. "Shift," her wolf was saying. "Shift, shift now, let me out." But she'd never shifted. She didn't know how. The wolf had been caged since she was 4 years old. She didn't know the mechanics of it, the feeling of it, the release. Cyrus raised his hands. The sphere of dark energy swelled, doubling in size, crackling with a sound like tearing fabric. "Hold still," he said. "This won't hurt." She knew he was lying. The bond with Kyle flared. She felt his rage hit her like a physical blow, felt him turning, running back toward the fortress. But he was too far. Minutes away. She didn't have minutes. Cyrus released the spell. It hit her in the chest, and the world went dark. Not black, but void dark, the absence of everything. And she felt the enchantment wrapping around her wolf again. The same cage, the same bars, closing in, tightening. Her wolf howled, thrashing, fighting, and Elara fought with her, pushing back against the magic with everything she had. But it wasn't enough. The warlock's power was old and practiced and vicious, and the cage was closing, and she could feel her wolf weakening, the silver light dimming, and she was going to lose her again. She was going to lose everything. Then she heard it. Not through her ears. Through the bond. Kyle's howl, rolling across the snow-covered landscape, shaking the trees, vibrating through the stone walls and the shattered windows and the floor beneath her hands. It hit her like a bolt of lightning, not his voice, but his will, his refusal, his absolute flat rejection of a universe in which she could be taken from him. Her wolf heard it, and her wolf answered. Elara threw her head back and howled, not a whisper, not a broken rasp, the full howl of a lunar wolf, the sound that had ended wars and shattered enchantments and called the dead back from the dark. It erupted from her throat and filled the room and blew outward through the hole in the wall, silver white, visible, a shockwave of sound and light that hit Cyrus square in the chest. The warlock flew backward. His spell shattered around her like a glass, the dark energy fragmenting and dissolving into nothing, and he hit the courtyard stones with a crack that echoed off the fortress walls. The sphere of energy between his hands winked out. He lay in the snow, gasping, his white eyes flickering like a dying lamp. Elara stood. The silver light was pouring from her skin again, brighter this time, so bright that the snow around her glowed. She could feel her wolf inside her, not just awake but ascendant, filling every cell of her body with power that hummed like a struck bell. She shifted. It happened without thought, without effort, as natural as breathing. Her body dissolved and reformed, and where a thin, scarred woman had stood, a wolf now stood. Massive. Silver-furred, not grey, not white, but actual silver, metallic and luminous, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. Her eyes were pale blue, ice blue, ancient blue, and when she stepped forward, the snow melted beneath her paws. Cyrus looked up at her from the ground. His white eyes widened, and for the first time, something crossed his face that wasn't malice or amusement. It was terror. Impossible, he breathed. The line was broken. The line was... She growled. The sound was low and vast, and it made the stones of the courtyard vibrate. She stepped toward him, and he scrambled backward, the robes tearing on the rough stone, his hands shaking as he tried to summon another spell. Then Kyle was there. He came through the trees like a black comet, his wolves behind him, and the sight of Elara in her wolf form stopped him dead. He skidded to a halt in the snow, claws gouging the frozen earth, and his amber eyes fixed on her silver form with an expression that even a wolf's face couldn't hide. Mate. The word pulsed through the bond. My mate. Then he turned to Cyrus, and the expression vanished, replaced by something primal and utterly without mercy. He stalked forward, each paw placement deliberate, his lips pulling back from teeth that were longer than Elara's fingers, and the growl that came from his chest made the air itself feel heavier. Cyrus threw a bolt of energy. Kyle dodged it without breaking stride. Another bolt. Kyle's massive paw swatted it aside like a spark, the dark energy dissipating against his fur. The warlock's face contorted, and he threw everything he had, a massive wave of dark energy that blackened the snow where it touched. Elara stepped in front of Kale. The wave hit her chest. The silver light absorbed it, ate it, broke it down, and swallowed it the way sunlight swallows shadow. She felt the dark magic enter her, and felt her lunar blood dissolve it, dismantle it, render it harmless, and the light that radiated from her body pulsed brighter, brighter, until Cyrus was shielding his white eyes and screaming. Kyle came around her side. One lunge, his jaws closed on the warlock's shoulder and bore him to the ground, and the sound Cyrus made was high and thin and very human, and the fight was over. The remaining wolves Marjorie had sent either surrendered or ran. Most surrendered. They had felt the lunar howl. They had seen the silver wolf. They knew what it meant. Marjorie herself arrived 20 minutes later, dragged between two of Kyle's warriors, her face twisted with fury, and something else. Something that looked like the dawning realization that the world she'd built was collapsing around her. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe knot and hands that were calloused from years of running a pack through intimidation rather than respect. Kyle had shifted back to human form. He stood in the courtyard in borrowed clothes, blood on his neck from the marking bite, blood on his hands from the battle, and he looked at Marjorie with an expression that would have made a statue flinch. 23 years, he said. You kept a lunar wolf caged for 23 years. You fed her on scraps. You made her sleep in a cellar. You hired a warlock to steal her voice and imprison her wolf, and you would have let the enchantment kill her rather than risk your pack's position. Marjorie lifted her chin. She was not a woman who crumbled. The lunar line brings chaos, she said. Her voice was steady, almost calm. Every time a lunar wolf rises, the territories go to war. I did what I did to keep my pack alive. You did what you did to keep your power, Kyle said. Is there a difference? The question hung in the cold air. Ilara, back in human form now, wrapped in someone's cloak, standing with Rena, who was conscious again, and holding her bandaged arm stiffly, looked at Marjorie and felt something complicated. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but a recognition that Marjorie's cruelty had been strategic rather than pathological, that somewhere under the iron exterior was a woman who had made a calculation and followed it to its logical, monstrous conclusion. It didn't make it better, but it made it human. "You'll stand trial before the Council of Pax," Kyle said. "The lunar line has rights of judgment under the old laws, and those rights now belong to my mate. She will decide your punishment." Marjorie's eyes moved to Ilara. Something flickered there, brief and strange, something that might have been surprise at seeing the Stellar Omega standing upright and unmarked by fear. Or it might have been something else entirely. Marjorie looked at her for a long time, and then she said something that no one in the courtyard expected. "You survived," she said. "I didn't think you would." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't admiration. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flatness of a woman who had underestimated someone and was honest enough to acknowledge it. Ilara looked back at her. She opened her mouth. Her voice was still raw, still new, still scratched at the edges like a record played on a worn needle. But it was hers. "I did," she said. 2 words. Everything she needed to say. They took Marjorie away. Cyrus, still alive, but barely, was carried to the cells beneath the fortress. The Ashwood wolves who had surrendered were given a choice: swear fealty to the Northern Territories or be escorted to the unclaimed lands beyond the Eastern Mountains. Most swore. A few didn't. Bram, standing at the edge of the courtyard with his bruised face and his complicated guilt, watched his mother being led away and said nothing. Later that night, Ilara found him sitting on the steps of the East Barracks, staring at the snow. She sat down beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. The silence between them was nothing like the silence of the cellar. It was the silence of 2 people who shared a history too tangled to summarize. Finally, Bram said, "The bread was stale. I know it was always stale. I couldn't take it from the fresh batch without her noticing." Ilara looked at him. Then she signed, because her voice was fading again, and she was learning to switch between both. "It was the best thing I ate all week. Every week." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. His shoulders shook once. Then he stood and walked back inside without another word, and she let him go. Because some debts are too complicated to settle with gestures or tears. You just carry them. The weeks that followed were a blur of politics and logistics, and the slow, strange work of becoming a person with a pack and a mate, and a wolf and a voice. Kyle announced their bond to the allied packs in a formal ceremony that involved approximately 300 wolves, a feast that lasted 2 days, and a speech from Kale that was exactly 4 sentences long, because the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was not, as it turned out, a man who enjoyed public speaking. "This is Ilara," he said, standing on the dais in the great hall with her beside him, his hand on the small of her back, his marking bite visible above his collar. "She is my bonded mate, the last of the lunar bloodline, and the lunar of the Northern Territories. Anyone who threatens her threatens me. That is all I have to say about it." The silence that followed was so total that Ilara could hear the candles flickering. Then Rena, standing at the foot of the dais with her arm in a sling and a cut above her eye that was going to leave a spectacular scar, pressed her fist to her chest. "Luna," she said. The word spread through the hall like a wave. 300 wolves, pressing their fists to their chests, bowing their heads, and the word rising and rising until the rafters shook. Luna, Luna, Luna. Ilara stood in the light and the sound and the warmth of 300 people choosing to see her, and she didn't cry because she was done with crying in rooms full of people. But she took Kyle's hand and squeezed it hard enough that his knuckles cracked, and he looked down at her with that expression again. The one from the snow, the one from the study, the one that made her feel like the most found person in the world. Marjorie's trial was held before the council 2 weeks later. Ilara could have demanded execution under the old laws. She didn't. She sentenced Marjorie to exile in the unclaimed lands, stripped of pack status, stripped of wolf, alone. Marjorie accepted the sentence, with her chin held high and her back straight, and she walked out of the council hall without looking back, and Ilara watched her go and felt nothing clean, nothing simple, just the complicated ache of a wound that was healing crookedly. Cyrus died in his cell 3 days after the battle. The lunar howl had done something to his magic, burned it out of him like a fever burning out an infection. Without his power, he was just an old man, with white eyes and a body that couldn't sustain itself. Renna found him in the morning, curled on his side, hands folded over his chest as if he'd been praying. Spring came slowly to the Northern Territories, the way spring always comes to cold places, grudgingly, in fits and starts, freezing and thawing and freezing again. The snow retreated from the courtyard first, then from the trails, then from the clearing beyond the eastern tree line where Ilara had knelt in the cold and written a name she didn't understand. On the first warm night, when the air smelled like wet earth and pine sap and the faintest promise of green, Kyle took her back to the clearing. The snow was almost gone. Just patches remained, thin and crystalline, clinging to the shadows of the trees. Kyle stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the bare earth where the name had been written 100 times and erased 100 times. "I stood right here," he said. "That first night. I could see you in the dark, kneeling in the snow, and I didn't know who you were yet. But my wolf did." He almost broke through. I had to grip a tree branch so hard it snapped to keep myself from going to you. Ilara walked to the center of the clearing. She crouched and pressed her hand to the earth. It was cold and damp, the soil soft from the thaw, and she could smell the mineral richness of it, the life sleeping just beneath the surface. "I didn't know why I wrote it," she said. Her voice was stronger now, still quiet, still prone to disappearing at the end of long sentences. But hers, "I just knew I had to." "The bond," he said, "reaching for you before either of us understood what it was." She stood. He was watching her from the edge of the clearing, leaning against a pine tree with his arms crossed, and the moonlight made his amber eyes glow faintly, and his expression was the unguarded one, the one he only wore when they were alone. She walked to him, stood in front of him, put her hands on his chest, over the marking bite that had scarred into a crescent shape on the left side of his neck. "Thank you," she said, "for following the footprints." He uncrossed his arms and pulled her close, and she pressed her face against his neck and breathed in pine and smoke and embers, and his hands were warm on her back, and the night was quiet around them, and somewhere in the forest a wolf howled, real and wild and free, and hers answered from inside her chest, not a sound, just a feeling, a vibration, a silver hum that said, "Home, home, home." The last patch of snow in the clearing melted sometime before dawn. By morning, there was nothing left of the name she'd written. But that was all right. She didn't need to write it in the snow anymore. She carried it in the scar on her neck and the wolf in her chest, and the warmth of the man sleeping beside her, his breath slow and steady, his hand curled around hers even in sleep, holding on the way he always did, like he'd spent 12 years learning how to find her, and intended to spend the rest of his life never letting go.